The form had a line near the bottom that said, "Name of the person collecting you." Graham had answered everything else without stopping. Date of birth, allergies, none. His GP surgery on Barnsley Road, 8 ticks in the no column about his heart, 1 tick in the yes column about his gallbladder. A signature, the date, which was the 14th of February 2023, and which he noticed and decided not to think about. And then, that one empty space again, waiting. He was sitting on a moulded plastic chair the colour of weak tea in a cubicle on a day surgery unit in Sheffield, with a paper curtain half drawn on a metal rail. His clothes were folded on the seat beside him. He was wearing a hospital gown, tied at the back, and his own socks, because he had read online that you were allowed to keep your own socks, and he had found that unreasonably reassuring. He held the biro over the line for a long time. It is not that he could not think of anybody. That is the thing that gets misunderstood about this, almost every single time. He could think of names, he could have written 40. What he could not do was write one of them into a box that would become a phone call, and then a car journey across the city in February rain, and then somebody standing in a corridor at 4:30 in the afternoon, holding a paper cup of coffee, waiting for him to be well enough to be driven home. A nurse came round the curtain with a clipboard and a plastic tray. Her name was Ellie. Her lanyard was covered in enamel pins. "Who's collecting you, love?" "I'll get a taxi," Graham said. "We can't discharge you into a taxi on your own after a general anaesthetic. Someone has to be with you for 24 hours. He said, "Right," and then, because the silence needed something put into it, he said, "I'll sort something out." Ellie's pen hovered exactly the way his biro had hovered. Then she wrote something down and said she would come back, and the curtain swung, and he was on his own again. Graham took out his phone. 214 contacts. He scrolled with his thumb, slowly, the way you read a menu you have already decided you're not going to order from. His sister's name went past, Denise, 14 months since they had spoken, and not because of anything. There had been no argument. He would have struggled to explain to a stranger what had gone wrong between him and his sister, because nothing had gone wrong between him and his sister. That was the entire difficulty. There was no breach to repair, and therefore no occasion to phone, and therefore 14 months. He put the phone face down on his folded shirt. He was 54 years old and, by any ordinary measure, a perfectly likeable man. People at work liked him, actually liked him, not out of politeness. He was the one who noticed a haircut. He knew which of the sales team had a daughter sitting her A-levels, and he asked how they had gone, and he remembered the answer. That December he had been given 3 Christmas cards, and one of them had a joke written inside it that only made sense if you knew him, and that is the kind of card you only ever get from somebody who has genuinely thought about you. He went to the pub after work sometimes. He left early, usually. He walked home along a terraced street past other people's front windows, the blue flicker of televisions behind net curtains, and he did not feel especially sorry for himself. That last part matters. This is not a story about a sad man. It is a story about a very ordinary kind of arithmetic. On conservative estimates, there are several million adults in Britain who could not confidently name one person they would ring at 3 in the morning. They are not unpleasant people. Most of them do not live alone. They have colleagues, cousins, neighbours who take in parcels, a group chat with 11 people in it that goes off every Saturday about football. And before any of the rest of it makes sense, one distinction has to be made properly. Being alone and being lonely are not the same thing, and neither one reliably produces the other. You can be alone all week and be completely well, somebody walking a dog across the moor at 7 in the morning, not speaking to another human being until Tuesday, entirely intact and rather pleased about it. Solitude that is chosen is not a wound. Some people need it in large quantities and get ill without it. And you can be lonely in a crowded room. You can be lonely at your own birthday party, holding a drink, being toasted by people who mean it. You can be lonely lying beside somebody you have been married to for 22 years, which is a specific and under-discussed version of the thing, and one of the most painful going. Loneliness is not a head count. It is the distance between the connection you have and the connection you need, which means it can open up in front of you, while the head count stays exactly where it was. So, how does a likeable man with 214 contacts end up holding a biro above an empty line? To answer that, you have to stop treating loneliness as a flaw in somebody's personality and start treating it as an alarm. Hunger is an alarm. It is not a moral failing. It is a signal produced by a body that has noticed a shortfall and would like you to do something about it, and it is deliberately unpleasant because a pleasant hunger would not work. Thirst is the same. pain is the same. Every one of these systems runs on an identical principle. Make the deficit uncomfortable enough that the animal takes action. Loneliness is that system for people. For almost all of human history, being separated from your group was not sad. It was lethal. A person on their own could not hunt reliably, could not sleep safely, could not survive a broken leg or a fever or a hard winter. Isolation was, in the most literal sense, a mortal threat. So a signal evolved that makes social separation feel bad. Bad enough that you act on it. Bad enough that you walk back towards the fire. That is what the feeling is for. It is not evidence that you are unlovable. It is a smoke alarm. And like every alarm, it does something else as well. It changes how you see the room. Beginning in the 1990s, a research group in Chicago spent the better part of 3 decades taking this apart, and the findings are consistent enough to be uncomfortable. When somebody has been lonely for a sustained period, their attention retunes. They become faster at spotting social threat in a scene, a turned shoulder, a glance exchanged between two other people, and slower to look away from it once they have. They remember the negative social information from an evening more accurately than the warm parts. Shown a neutral face, one that is neither friendly nor cold, they are more likely than other people to read it as cold. Every one of those adjustments is intelligent. If your survival depends on not being cast out of the group, then a system that catches the earliest signs of rejection is worth having, and worth having on a hair trigger. Better 100 false alarms than 1 missed exile. But run that system for 2 years instead of 2 weeks, and you get something with a very unfortunate shape. Because a person on high alert for rejection behaves differently. They test. They hold back the last 20%. They arrive at things already braced. They read an unanswered message and reach a conclusion from it. They withdraw preemptively from the situation that was about to hurt them, which is completely rational, and which also removes them from the room. And people notice, not consciously, and not unkindly. They simply find the guarded person slightly harder work, slightly harder to reach, and human beings are efficient creatures. We go where the door is already open, so the guarded person gets approached a little less, which confirms the alarm, which raises the vigilance, which increases the guarding. That is the loop. It is a system built to protect a connection, which, left running long enough, dismantles the connection instead. Like a fever that begins as a defense and ends up being the thing that makes you ill. Graham could show you that loop inside a single message thread, if he were willing to, which he is not. In the spring of 2022, a colleague called Vanessa mentioned that there was a quiz on at a pub in Nether Edge. He messaged her 3 days later to ask which night it ran. She did not reply for 2 days, and when she did reply, it was to an entirely different part of the conversation, about a spreadsheet. Now, Vanessa had a broken boiler and a mother in hospital that week, and she had scrolled past his message on a bus. There is no version of events in which she was sending a signal. Graham received a signal. He did not decide anything dramatic. He did not conclude that she disliked him. He just quietly took the pub quiz out of the category of things that were available to him, the way you take a jumper out of a drawer and put it in a bag for the charity shop. No ceremony, no grief, a small adjustment to the inventory of what you own. He did not ask again, and that is how this actually happens. Not in a rupture, but in 1,000 quiet withdrawals of an application. Which brings us to the second mechanism, and it is the one that does the most damage, precisely because it is entirely passive. Nobody decides this. Ask anybody in this position when it happened, and they cannot tell you. There is no date, there was no falling out, nobody was cruel to anybody. What happened is that the intervals widened. Graham met Rob in 1989, in the queue for a bus that never came, and they were friends for 30 years without either of them ever having to work at it. Rob was best man at Graham's wedding in 1996, and made a speech with a joke about a caravan in it that people were still repeating 11 years later. They saw each other twice a week, then once a week, then most weekends, because Rob had 2 children by then, and children reorganise a calendar without asking anyone's permission, then monthly. Then, whenever one of them had a reason. Then, Rob's job moved to Derby, and Graham's marriage ended, and both of those things consume an enormous quantity of a person's available attention. And then, there was a long stretch in which neither of them was in any distress whatsoever. They were both simply busy in the completely ordinary way, and every few months one of them would send something. A photograph of a pub they had once been thrown out of, 4 words, Good times that. The last exchange in that thread is from August 2019. Rob wrote, "We should sort something next month?" Graham replied, "Definitely. Let me look at shifts." Neither of them ever wrote anything after that. Nobody was wronged. Nobody noticed. A thread simply stopped mid-sentence, the way a conversation stops when a train arrives, and then 30 years of friendship sat perfectly preserved and entirely inactive inside a phone in the form of 2 unfulfilled sentences about next month. Then came 2020, which took a slow, ordinary process and put it on a fast setting for 2 years. Every weak tie in the country went quiet at the same moment. The neighbour, the person from the five-a-side, the friend of a friend you saw 4 times a year, and a good number of them never came back, because weak ties are held together almost entirely by proximity and habit, and both of those were suspended by law. The cruelty of erosion is not the loss. It is the absence of a date. Grief gets a funeral. An argument gets an apology. Erosion has nothing to point at, no injury, no villain, no anniversary, and therefore nothing obvious to repair. You cannot apologise for August 2019. What would you even be apologising for? And now, the third mechanism, which catches the most capable people, and which Graham fell into hardest of all. He had always been the one who helped. He had a van until 2014, and everybody knew it. He moved 4 separate people's furniture in one summer. He sat up until 3 in the morning with a friend the week after a diagnosis, and drove him to 2 appointments, and never mentioned it to anybody. He was the one you rang. Here is what nobody tells you about being that person. Every time you help somebody, you receive a small deposit of something genuinely valuable. Usefulness, standing, the pleasant certainty that you are the one who gives rather than the one who takes. And every single time, you also skip 1 repetition of the opposite exercise, the one where you ask. Asking is a skill. It has a learning curve, like any other. It gets easier with practice, and the practice is small. Borrowing a ladder, asking for a lift to the garage, saying I've had a rotten week, have you got 10 minutes? Each one is a tiny rehearsal, and people who do them regularly barely register that they are doing anything at all. Somebody who has coped alone since they were 16 does not accumulate those rehearsals. They arrive at 50 with a fully developed capacity to be relied upon and an almost completely untrained capacity to rely. And because they have never made a low-stakes ask, the first one they ever attempt is a high-stakes one, made under pressure, at the worst available moment, from a plastic chair on a day surgery unit with a biro in their hand and a nurse coming back in 4 minutes. Of course, it feels enormous. They have nothing to measure it against. And underneath all 3 mechanisms sits a piece of accounting. Ask people in this position why they do not simply phone the names they can perfectly well recite, and if you keep asking gently enough, you eventually arrive at the ledger. They believe a call has to be earned. That contact requires a reason. News, a birthday, a favour to return, a piece of good fortune worth sharing, something brought to the table. Arriving empty-handed does not feel neutral to them. It feels like a withdrawal from an account that is already overdrawn. I'll ring when I've got something to say. Which sounds like ordinary good manners, and is in fact a door closing very slowly, because the state in which a person most needs to phone somebody is precisely the state in which they have nothing whatsoever to offer. Tired, flat, frightened about a scan, nothing funny to report, no news, no anecdote. That is the exact moment the ledger disqualifies you, and the debt compounds. Every month you do not call, the call becomes more expensive. Now the gap itself has to be explained. Now there is an implied apology built into the first sentence. At 14 months, phoning your own sister requires a preamble. At 3 years, it requires a reason so large that only a catastrophe would qualify, and if the only permissible reason is a catastrophe, then you will not be phoning anybody about anything ordinary ever again, which is how a well-liked man ends up with 214 contacts and a blank line. And here is where the whole thing turns over, because everything described so far sounds like a shortage, and there wasn't one. Graham did not have nobody. Graham had a great many people. Denise would have got in the car, she would have complained about the M1 for the entire journey, and brought a bag of food he had not asked for, and she would have been quietly delighted to have been asked, because she had spent 14 months assuming that her brother was fine and busy and had a full life and did not need her for anything. Rob would have gone. Rob would have taken the day off and been faintly insulted not to have been the first call. Take the list honestly, name by name, and there were 11 people who would have driven to that hospital. So what had gone missing was not the people. It was not the names or the numbers or even the affection. The affection was entirely intact on both sides and simply not in use. What had gone was permission, the belief that he was allowed to be an inconvenience to any of them. That is the actual injury, not an absence of relationships, an absence of the felt right to impose on the relationships he already had. And the reason this matters so enormously is that the belief is measurably, demonstrably wrong. When researchers ask people to predict how likely somebody is to grant them a modest favour, people underestimate, badly and consistently, and by something in the region of half. They underestimate how willing others are to help. They underestimate how warmly the request will be received. They underestimate how good the other person will feel about having been asked. And in the same breath, they overestimate how much of an imposition it is, how irritated the person will be, and how harshly they will be judged for having needed something at all. We are, as a species, systematically wrong in one direction. We believe we are burdens far more than we actually are. And there is a reason that error is so difficult to correct from the inside. You never find out. If you do not ask, no information comes back. The belief is never tested, so it is never contradicted, and an untested belief of this kind does not sit politely still. It hardens, so what actually shifts it? Not a reunion. This is where the instinct is wrong, and the wrongness of that instinct is what keeps people stuck for years at a time. The natural plan is a big one, a proper phone call, long overdue, an explanation, an apology for the silence, a real catch-up, 2 hours, emotionally honest, everything addressed. And a plan of that size requires courage, energy, a free evening and a script, and because it requires all 4 at once, it never happens on a Tuesday when you are tired, which is every Tuesday. The thing that works is almost embarrassingly small. It is a low-stakes ask. Specifically, ask for something you don't actually need. Ask which of 2 hotels is better. Ask whether you can borrow a drill. Ask for the name of their dentist. Ask what they thought of the second series. The content is irrelevant. The content is scaffolding. What matters is that a request has been made and the ledger has been tested on something trivial, where the stakes are so low that even a slow reply cannot possibly mean anything. Because an ask is not a burden. That is the misreading sitting at the centre of all of this. An ask is an offer. You are handing somebody the opportunity to be useful to you, and being useful to somebody you like is one of the most reliably pleasant experiences available to a human being. When you decline to ask, you are not sparing them anything, you are keeping something from them. In November 2023, 9 months after the day surgery unit, Graham texted Rob. He did it badly. He wrote, "Sorry, out of nowhere this. You still got that petrol mower, mine's given up, and I'm not buying one for the size of that lawn." That is not a beautiful message. It contains an apology, a justification, and a hedge, all in the first 9 words. It is the message of a man who has not done this in 4 years, Rob replied in 4 minutes. Mate, yes. Also, where the hell have you been? They spoke on the phone that evening for 51 minutes, and roughly 45 of those minutes were about nothing whatsoever. A caravan, a manager who had been sacked, Rob's daughter, failing her driving test on a roundabout, the mower, which Graham never actually borrowed. Neither of them addressed the 4 years. Neither of them mentioned August 2019. There was no reckoning, no apology, and no emotional conversation about the silence. And it turned out that none of that was necessary, which is the thing almost everybody in this position gets wrong. They believe the gap has to be discussed before contact can resume. It doesn't. It only has to be interrupted. Graham had a second procedure in the summer of 2024. Routine, planned. The same unit, the same moulded plastic chairs, the colour of weak tea, the same paper curtain on the same metal rail. Same form, same line near the bottom. He wrote a name on it, and a mobile number in blue biro, and handed the clipboard back without thinking about it very much at all. And the entire business took 4 seconds. That is the size of the repair, not a transformation. 4 seconds of handwriting, arriving at the end of one badly written text message about a lawnmower. If a name has turned up in your head while you have been listening, and for most people one does, and it usually turns up early, then the thing worth knowing is this. They are extremely unlikely to be annoyed. They are considerably more likely to be relieved. And there is a genuine chance that they are sitting on their own side of the very same silence, running the very same arithmetic, waiting for a reason that feels large enough to justify getting in touch. It does not have to be large enough, it only has to be small enough to actually send. Ask them something you don't need to know.